If the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a shot to the body of the peace dividend in Europe, then the fissure with the United States looks like it might be the double tap. Security apprehension across the European Union and other non-US NATO allies is now so high that some surveys show respondents ranking security and defence as a more important priority than the likes of immigration or the economy. Support for raising defence spending appears to be consistently high, and even before Trump assumed the American presidency, a common defence and security policy in Europe had majority support in every member state. Put another way, when the Germans are considering loosening their famously strict debt rules, and you have countries like Poland and France calling actively for German rearmament, it's probably fair to say that you live in interesting times. And so today, we're going to turn our attention to Europe as it appears to be on the cusp of a major rearmament effort, which, unlike the investments we saw in 2022 through 2024, seem like they may be focused not just on rebuilding the continent's ability to defend itself against Russia, but also to secure greater industrial and defence independence from Washington. To do that, we'll break this up into a couple of components, starting with what we've heard about European rearmament plans so far, including the ReArm Europe plan and Germany's proposed reforms to the country's debt brake, and then try and match those resources to a better understanding of the challenge, including the topical issue of the hour, Europe's reliance on American weapon systems and enablers, and why Europe might feel a need to reduce that reliance. We'll look at a couple of case studies demonstrating that reliance, including nuclear weapons, air combat, and satellite internet and communications, before closing out with some very big picture questions that we can ask even at this opening stage. If rearmament does go ahead as expected, how could it go wrong? And what are some of the things it might take to get it right? But before we get into the why, what, and how it could go wrong of European rearmament, a quick word from a sponsor. So let me welcome back returning sponsor and my long-term VPN of choice, Private Internet Access. As a basic enabler of modern communications, business, and your ability to watch defence economics PowerPoints, the internet does have a lot going for it. But for all of its massive advantages, our broader digital environment can come with some rough edges, with concerns over issues like privacy and fragmentation. And so just like a tank might want to combine different survivability measures like camouflage, armour, and an active protection system, when you're navigating the digital world, you might want to layer different tools and practices together. There's the obvious stuff like careful browsing, strong passwords, and being a tad suspicious when someone claims the tax office will be taking payment in gift cards this year. And then if you're like me, you might also want to use a VPN. With a click, what that can allow you to do is reroute internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, and also potentially shift the way in which your activity is logged. Private Internet Access, for example, has long claimed to have a no-logs policy that's been independently reviewed and court-tested. They also advertise compatibility with a range of streaming services, servers in more than 84 countries, and for those who want a little more precision, all 50 US states. Plus, it's available cross-platform, and a single subscription covers an unlimited number of devices, which could be pretty handy if, like me, you have more than a couple of devices on the go. And so if you are interested, there'll be a link in the description which gives access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 additional bonus months, covering an unlimited number of devices with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so with my thanks to Private Internet Access for their support of the channel, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's start with resourcing and what we've already seen announced out of Europe, because I think it's fair to say you can get a lot more with a plan and a whole bunch of funding than you can with just a plan. And so what I think we've seen in some of these cases quite reasonably is an effort to solve the funding problem first, and leaving the question of exactly what to spend it on until a little bit later. One of the big moves in this area that captured a lot of attention was the ReArm Europe package. This was announced by Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission. As you can see from the headline on the right, a lot of coverage described this as an €800 billion plan. But if you read into it a little bit more, you'll see that the package is actually a range of measures, and that 800 billion figure is more of an assumptions-driven guess. And so for our purposes, there are 3 main bits of ReArm that I want to look at. The first is financing for joint procurement. This calls for 150 billion euros in financing, roughly 165 billion US dollars, for member states that want to undertake defence investments like joint procurements. The idea here is that member states could draw on that 150 billion to make investments in critical capability areas like air and missile defence, artillery, drone and anti-drone systems, and then hopefully as a secondary benefit, free up more existing equipment to potentially be sent to Ukraine. 150 billion euros is obviously a lot of money, especially if it's squarely focused on procurement. But you're probably wondering where the remaining 650 comes from. The answer is it's not actually EU funding, it's the EU allowing its members to spend more. Under ordinary circumstances, EU member states are meant to be limited in how much debt they can go into and how quickly. The EU can't actually stop nations going beyond that level, but it can eventually fine them. What the ReArm Europe plan proposes to do is activate what's called the National Escape Clause, and essentially say that if the reason nations are going into deficit is to fund defence spending, that doesn't actually count. So where does the 650 billion figure come from? It was basically just an illustrative example. When the package was being announced, von der Leyen reportedly said the following, quote, "For example, if member states would increase their defence spending by 1.5% of GDP on average, this could create fiscal space of close to 650 billion euros over a period of 4 years." End quote. But there's nothing yet to say whether member states will increase by more or less than 1.5% of GDP on average, how long it will take them to get there, and how many years they plan to sustain it for. Some EU member states have already massively ramped up military spending, and Poland's president is now talking about enshrining 4% GDP for defence minimum in the state's constitution. But how spending ends up looking at an alliance-wide level will probably come down significantly to decisions made by some of the economic heavy hitters. And so to illustrate that, let's head over to Berlin for perhaps the most make-or-break example of them all. Because as historically ironic as it might be, you now have a situation where much of Europe, including the Poles and the French, are actively calling on Germany to rearm. And the man who is most likely to be Germany's next chancellor has put a massive plan on the table to accomplish that. Merz hasn't exactly minced his words on the topic, saying, quote, "In view of threats to our freedom and peace on the continent, the rule for our defence now has to be whatever it takes," end quote. The challenge he faces is Germany's so-called debt brake. This places a very, very tight limit on the deficit the German government could run in any given year. Merz's proposal is to essentially exempt high levels of defence spending from that debt brake calculation, so that if the government is only allowed to run a deficit of 0.35% of GDP, it's actually 0.35% of GDP plus defence above a certain level. Along with that change, he's also agreed with another party, the SPD, to bundle in a €500 billion fund for infrastructure investment, basically proposing not just to invest in defence, but also things that boost the economy and productive capacity. Germany for a long time has arguably been cheaping out on its infrastructure, including when it comes to transportation. So the theory here is essentially that if that investment deficit is reversed, it might boost productivity across the entire economy. Compared to other OECD countries, it has a very low debt to GDP ratio of around 62%, so roughly half that of the United States. Partly as a result, borrowing costs are very, very low. At time of recording, German 10-year bonds have a yield beginning with a 2, which, once you account for the effect of inflation, is just about as close to free money as you can get. It also means that Germany could roughly borrow about 7 times as much money as Russia and pay the same amount of interest on it. And so if the money supply for the investment is there, so too arguably is the demand. At the moment, the German economy is basically stagnating. Trade wars with the United States are unlikely to help, and even before that, the traditional manufacturing-led export model was under threat. The expectation then is if a lot of investment is pushed into the economy to modernise infrastructure, increase efficiency, and also generate new demand for military goods, that might be a pretty effective way to get things kick-started again. The situation is apparently so clear that reportedly S&P Global said that Germany borrowing more money to invest into its economy and ramp up production would actually be beneficial for the country's AAA credit rating. When the people who tell everyone not to borrow money start saying that you're being a cheapskate and you really need to invest in your economy, then maybe it's time to borrow some money and get some investment going. The other massive advantage Germany has here is the potential for conversion. And I don't mean the changing religion or sports team kind, I mean your car factory now builds tanks kind. To an extent, we've already seen it. In 2024, Rheinmetall came to an agreement to take auto workers who'd been laid off and retrain them into the defence sector. The company said it would repurpose 2 factories that had previously made car parts to instead produce military goods, and reportedly they're not the only ones doing it. KNDS purchased a rail car plant in Görlitz, which is reportedly going to be retooled to produce parts for military vehicles. The point is, unlike so many other countries, Germany doesn't have to start from scratch when it comes to productive capital or a skilled workforce. Some of that can be repurposed from parts of the civilian sector that are struggling, with the potential hope then being that the companies who bring in cash by selling off those facilities, coupled with the government investing in new infrastructure, means that the very, very large parts of the civil sector that remain will probably have a better chance of becoming more efficient and competing effectively. Bypassing the debt brake like this requires a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag. And once the members who were elected in Germany's most recent election take their seats later this month, the path to getting a 2/3 majority in favour of reform would be a bit more complicated. AfD on the right and Die Linke to the left will control enough seats collectively that reform to the debt brake wouldn't be possible without the support of at least one of them, meaning that if Merz wanted to go big, he also had a very strong incentive to go quickly. He first struck an agreement between his centre-right CDU-CSU and the centre-left SPD, and then approached the German Greens. Historically, the Greens in Germany have been some of the loudest voices condemning Vladimir Putin and calling for additional support for Ukraine. Eventually, it appears a deal was struck. The final version appears to allocate 100 billion of the 500 billion in infrastructure spending to Germany's Economic Transformation and Climate Fund. exempts all defence spending above 1% of GDP from the debt brake calculations, and also broadened the definition of defence spending to include civil defence, IT security, intelligence, as well as, quote, aid to states attacked in violation of international law, end quote, which I think strongly suggests that future German military aid to Ukraine will also be covered. I'm not going through all this because I think we need to be intricately aware of internal German political processes, but rather to illustrate a point. The EU plan relies on nations stepping up in a way that most of them haven't done to date, with the German decision being perhaps the most impactful for the state of the European economy and European rearmament as a whole. If this hadn't gone through, it might have been a false start for the entire process. But as it is, signs seem to point in favour of real progress, and we have Germany's likely soon-to-be Chancellor declaring that Germany is back. There are also other changes in the proposal intended to get more money on the table. One is to allow cohesion funds, which generally go to comparatively less wealthy European states, to invest in things like environment and transportation projects, to redirect those funds, if they choose to do so, towards defence and defence industry-related programs. If you're one of the states who receives those funds, like Poland, Romania, Latvia, or Lithuania, you might decide that instead of using those funds to build a new road, you're instead going to modernise your arms plants. There's no estimate for that included in the 800 billion figure, and how much of a difference it actually makes will come down to the decision those countries make. Similarly, there are other measures where the impact's going to be driven by the choices that private businesses make. There's talk of getting the European Investment Bank to make more investments in the defence and security sector, and also influencing private banks that don't currently lend to the defence sector or defence-related industries to adjust that policy, with the idea being that if the European defence sector is going to ramp up, they're going to need access to finance. And while some of that can come from the EU or the various member states, just like any other business, they're also probably going to want to access private debt markets. A final point here is that, courtesy of all of these changes and some of the American rhetoric we've seen, a lot of European defence primes are already going to have more capital available than they did even a month ago. When your share price goes up as a company, it tends to increase your access to capital, whether that be through borrowing or taking the opportunity to sell additional shares to the market while the price is comparatively high. And a lot of these firms haven't seen little increases, they've seen double or even triple-digit gains, to the point where we have seen a 135-year-old industrial giant appreciate at the kind of rates that are normally reserved for bloody meme stocks, meaning that if they decide it's the right time to invest, they're in a much better place to do so than they were not that long ago. But if we leave some of those factors that it's hard to estimate aside, how much money might we be talking about here? And while I accept it depends on a range of assumptions, including how all of this money is likely to be spent, I thought I'd work through a couple of charts to at least illustrate some possibilities. What you can see here is a chart showing US expenditure on new military equipment in 2024 versus that same measure for all of the other members of NATO. In nominal terms, more than $280 billion against roughly $160 billion. If you then assume that 150 billion euros will be spent over 4 years and directed towards joint procurements of military equipment, that gets your annual spend closer to 200 billion. And then if we use the von der Leyen's 650 billion euro figure over 4 years as a result of opening up that escape clause, the question becomes, how much of that are countries likely to spend on new kit as opposed to everything else? If you assume 30%, lower than the existing NATO average, you get to just over 250 billion per annum. Assume 60%, so more akin to what we've seen from the Polish budget buildup, and all of a sudden, your spending per annum overtakes the United States. As for that little bit on the end there, von der Leyen's number obviously doesn't include the United Kingdom, who've already said they're going to increase their spending, so I've tacked them on at the end as well. Basically, if von der Leyen's numbers and the associated assumptions are correct, this plan is a recipe for equipment spending parity with the United States. If you instead use the numbers I generated last week, where you assume that every NATO state that isn't currently spending at least 2.5% of GDP dials up to 2.5%, and everyone already above it stays there, you instead get this. Broadly a similar picture, but with the United States maintaining a slight spending lead rather than a slight spending disadvantage. And if you instead run those same figures but account for military purchasing power parity, you get something closer to this. What feels like more than 280 billion of equipment spending for the United States, and closer to 400 billion for the rest of NATO. The two obvious problems with doing that, of course, are 1, a lot of the PPP advantages these countries tend to enjoy is in the cheapness of their troops and their labour, not their military equipment, meaning we should really only be applying military PPP adjustments to defence spending as a whole, not just the equipment component. And secondly, because it doesn't account for the impact on pricing that everyone suddenly wanting to buy as many weapons as quickly as possible may well have, as we saw from such highlights as $6,000 155mm artillery rounds. If you suddenly have more procurement dollars chasing the same amount of productive capacity, prices are going to respond. Hence why things like the German infrastructure investments matter, or the plan to convert plants over to defence production matter. It's about trying to ramp up supply and scale in order to meet the emerging demand. But if you're looking for the big picture takeaway from the first section, here it is. How much money are the Europeans and other NATO members putting up for rearmament? We don't know yet. But if they only do just what we've seen announced so far, it's going to be a shit ton. In 2022, we obviously saw a significant change in rhetoric and some new money put on the table, but if these plans are followed through on, it could be on an entirely different level, closer to what we might associate with the United States or People's Republic of China, rather than post-peace dividend Europe. Okay, so if we can safely say that one change from 2022 is that now the money probably is actually there for rearmament, I think it's fair to say there's at least one other way in which things are now very, very different. Because now a lot of the focus in Europe isn't just on rearmament, it's on who supplies the arms. One of the side effects of NATO and all of its associated standardisation agreements is that you can have a lot of competition between defence companies within the NATO tent. If everyone's using basically the same doctrine, the same ammo, the same communication standards, then you have a lot of room potentially for competition and also importing foreign systems. And for most European countries most of the time, imported actually means American, with Europe as a whole being the largest purchasers and recipients of US weapons in 2024. Make no mistake, there is absolutely some stuff flowing in the other direction, whether that be direct purchases like the Naval Strike Missile, which the US is purchasing from Kongsberg in Europe so the LCS can do more than just cosplay as a surface combatant, or in other cases licensing products that are then produced in the US itself. The famous M777 howitzer, for example, is a licensed UK design. But US purchases from Europe are an absolute drop in the bucket compared to the flows in the other direction. This chart shows US weapon transfers to selected European states across two time periods, 2010 to 2013, so the 4 years before the Russian occupation of Crimea, and 2021 through 2024, an equivalent 4-year period which includes the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This data comes from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and is expressed in Trend Indicator Value, TIV. So it's not a dollar value, it's a calculated measure that's intended to adjust for inflation over time, which gives a whole different perspective to the way those orange lines from the early 2010s compare to the blue line from the 2020s. Before Russia moved on Ukraine, European imports from the United States were high. After Russia went into Ukraine, they went ballistic. Countries like Poland went from importing relatively little to more than the UK had between 2010 and 2013, while the Netherlands and Norway weren't that far removed from basically turning up the Lockheed Martin help desk, slapping their card on the table, saying I'll take it, and then refusing to elaborate. Of all the nations on this list, there are only 2 cases where US imports actually went backwards. Turkey, which has been in the process of rapidly indigenizing everything it can, and the French, who, being the French, were already buying very little American product, and yet somehow found a way to buy even less. And as a general rule, it wasn't just the raw numbers that were increasing, it was the scale of the reliance. This chart shows the share of weapon imports into each of those countries between 2021 and 2024, split between the blue bar, weapons from the United States, and the orange bar, literally everyone else. What you can see is that for most of those countries, the US accounted for a strict majority of imports. That was true for a lot of the big buyers, like the Germans, the Brits, and the Dutch, and the percentages were often fairly extreme. More than 70% for Germany, more than 90% for Italy, the Netherlands, and Norway, plus more than 90% for Sweden, and more than 80% for the UK. Meaning that while a lot of these nations were ramping up their military capabilities and storages to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what that actually meant in a lot of cases was just bringing more stuff in from the US. In many respects, the US was getting its dream scenario. NATO allies were spending more, rearming, and buying American. As for why, you could argue there were quite a few reasons there. Generally speaking, a lot of American equipment is regarded as being pretty damn good. And in some categories, there's really not a huge amount of existing competition. If you want an operational 5th-generation fighter in Europe, for example, barring a sudden and drastic change in the relationship with Beijing, your options are basically the F-35, the F-35, or you could buy the F-35. And if you don't buy the F-35, you have to be content flying a non-stealthy platform. American equipment was often also available, interoperable with existing and other NATO equipment, had network and logistics benefits because you'd be sharing a supply chain and benefit from upgrades designed in the United States. And, of course, Washington really likes it when you buy their stuff. And so in some ways, the purchase of US weapon systems became a way to pay back the United States for its security presence in Europe. The US provided a lot of the military muscle and security umbrella, and in exchange, European states provided the US military-industrial complex with a bunch of orders, which in turn enabled the US DIB to invest in research and development, generate scale, lower costs, and in so doing, boost US military potential. The concern in some European circles about that model, however, is it does create a relationship of dependence. In some ways, buying weapon systems, especially complex weapon systems like fighter jets from another country, is like entering a marriage. It requires trust, is generally intended to last many, many years, and the consequences of a divorce can be messy. With two of your biggest potential concerns as a buyer, being spare parts and sustainment, and secondly, having your chosen supplier use their power to block you from transferring a weapon system when you feel you really need to. I'd argue that for some countries from a security perspective, the capacity to transfer weapon systems might be as important for your security policy as being allowed to actually use them yourself. There would probably be far, far fewer risks involved for Sweden, for example, in transferring Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine, as opposed to sending Swedish jets into Russian airspace in order to pick a fight that way. But if you have, as the Swedes have, for example, chosen an American engine to power your jet, then while you're welcome to shoot at the Russians yourselves with them, you can't transfer them to someone else who's shooting at the Russians without Washington's permission. And if your goal is to have a more autonomous security policy, that might be a problem. I do want to stress, though, that this vulnerability, if you want to call it that, only really goes so far. I've recently seen a lot of media reports and commentary referring to so-called kill switches, for example, in exported American weapons like the F-35, with the idea here being that the US can apparently flick a switch and just brick any weapon system it's sold to another country. As far as the available evidence goes, that's probably bullshit. If Canada and the US ever got into a punch-up, for example, it's deeply doubtful the Pentagon could dial up all the Canadian F-35s and Order 66 them. If nothing else, building an actual digital off-switch into the platform would be a heck of a cyber warfare vulnerability, and the kind of thing a potential opponent would really, really want to get access to. For a neutral statement on the matter, we can look at what the Swiss Department of Defense has said, saying, quote, "A remote control or blocking of the F-35A fighter jets, for example through external interventions in the electronics, is not possible," end quote. However, if you read through their reported statements and others like them, there are potential independence concerns here that go beyond an actual kill switch. What you're generally talking about here then is a much longer-term degradation. F-35 sustainment and maintenance, for example, would be much more difficult if the Allies were cut off from ALICE, the Autonomic Logistics Information System, or from the successor Odin, or from software updates, or from assistance generating mission data files, the list goes on. Basically, without US support, the F-35 would be a more difficult aircraft to keep flying, and a less effective aircraft when it did. And yet, for some purchases of US weapon systems, that might still be considered a serious problem. Canada, for example, has said they'll be reviewing their planned purchase of the F-35. And while I think it's fair to say there'll likely be some very strong arguments in favour of going ahead with the acquisition of some or all of the planned 88 jets, the fact this review is happening at all probably has much less to do with the military capabilities of the F-35 as a platform, and more with the spectacular shift in US-Canadian relations and Canada's perception of the US as a desirable military equipment supplier. And as time goes on, they might not be the only ones reconsidering a potential acquisition of American kit. And while there are lots of elements that go into that, I want to highlight just one: a perceived change in how the United States approaches the issue of leverage when it comes to nominally allied countries. If you read Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, you'll find some sections that focus specifically on the topic of leverage. It says that leverage is having something the other guy wants, or better yet needs, or best of all simply can't do without, with the idea being that you should amass as much leverage as possible and then deploy it to get the best possible deal. The issue other countries face is that normally in international relations, the understanding within alliances is that countries don't use all of the types of leverage available to them, usually with much more focus on exchanging carrots as opposed to beating each other with sticks. You might choose to withhold a sweetheart trade deal, for example, or hold back on a potential foreign investment, or maybe choose not to give exemptions and tax breaks to another country's companies. But because security relationships do rely on long-term relations, on trust, on a willingness of people in the two countries to die for each other if necessary, there are certain tools countries could use to pressure each other which they don't do in order to preserve the rules of the game and enable them to compete and negotiate, yes, but without threatening the trust, the relationship, and the alliance. It's kind of like saying in a game of American football or rugby, for example, that you are allowed to tackle members of the opposing side in order to try and score a win, but you're not allowed to break out an AR-15 and gun down the opposing side, even if that would make scoring considerably easier. In part because once you did it the first time, no one would ever want to play you again. They'd be digging trenches and taking cover, not lining up on the field. Cutting off the supply of arms and spare parts is relatively high up that escalation chain, so a lot of countries would generally have perceived it to be a relatively low risk. But if the perception is that the White House is now much more willing to use whatever leverage it has in order to get the outcomes it wants, then suddenly it might become a larger risk. To give a geopolitical example, it's one thing to say that the United States would like to acquire Greenland. But if you then ask Washington whether they're willing to rule out the use of military force in order to get Greenland, a conventional answer would be something like, yes, of course, Denmark is a NATO ally, far from invading, we actually are obliged to defend it if anyone else attacks it, so of course there is no question of any military threat here. But we do think Greenland is important to the United States, and so we'll try and come up with an offer that's acceptable to the other side, noting that of course they can always say no. That statement probably wouldn't be overly welcome from a Danish or Greenlander perspective, but there'd be nothing in that to suggest that buying US weapons might be risky. If, however, the American line is that we won't rule out anything, including the use of military force, and we expect to get Greenland one way or another, from a Danish perspective, the only logical reason for Washington to do that would be because it wanted to use the fear and apprehension around potential military action as a source of leverage. And even if that option is later ruled out, they still might be left wondering why it wasn't ruled out in the first place. And so if you're entering a world where the United States appears much more willing to use whatever leverage it has available, including against allies, then maybe, the logic goes, they'd be more willing to use the risk of defanging your military as a source of leverage as well. Hence, if you look at some of the public European debates around this rearmament topic, you'll see attempts to balance a couple of competing goals. The first is to rearm as effectively as possible and quickly as possible, which might conceivably involve buying even more US systems, as we saw from 2022 through 24. And when the Americans for years have been calling on the Europeans to ramp up defence spending, that's probably the model they had in mind. A lot of extra European money going to purchase American stuff. But the balancing objective is to reduce reliance on the United States, ramp up Europe's own defence industrial base, and to expand and improve its own defence product offerings. So even if the other NATO states continue to purchase and operate American systems, they're never stuck without a practical alternative. Given that, I think it's incredibly unlikely that the Europeans gather together all their American weapon systems and burn them in a giant bonfire while Ode to Joy plays in the background. Instead, I'd suggest the approach we see is going to be more focused on de-risking, balancing the system out, reducing dependency, ensuring there are potential alternatives on offer. Because if you look at the way the balance of power in these kind of relationships work, the less utterly reliant you are on an imported system, the less leverage the seller has, and the more leverage the buyer has. If you think about it this way, whenever a seller cuts off access to supplies, they pay a reputational penalty. Other people are less likely to buy from you if you're in the business of shutting off supplies to people who have already paid for your products. But the amount of coercive value, the amount of damage you can do by following through on that threat, is directly related to how important your systems are for the country you're cutting off. If 100% of a country's air defence relied on F-35s and Patriots, for example, the threat of a US cutoff would have a lot of coercive power. But if that number is 25%, not 100%, sure, it would hurt, but the amount of coercive pressure is much lower, and there's much greater odds that they call your bluff. All the while, the reputational damage in the market you get for making that threat remains pretty much the same. The point is to reduce leverage here. The other NATO states wouldn't need to eliminate American systems from their inventories. They just have to make sure they're not absolutely reliant on them. So keeping all of that in mind, here's some of what we might expect to see. In the short term, major boost to procurement funding, but with less of it focused on American products. But because the defence production probably just isn't there to support that process in the way many of these countries, especially in Europe, might like, I think over the medium to long term, we'll also see step 2. Significant efforts to both A, boost European and allied production, and secondly, to come up with products or versions of products that don't rely on American export-controlled components. That way, even if Washington continues to exercise some control over how these countries use some of their inventory, they'll still have some stuff that they can freely transfer or use at will. A Poland that was blocked from re-exporting Abrams, for example, might not worry so much if it can just keep those for home defence and instead re-export its K2s or Leopards, with the underlying goal, to paraphrase Merz, being the reduction of reliance on the United States and increased independence from the United States. But if that is the goal, and for now many European actors appear to be saying it is, it raises questions of how they might fill in the gap, so to speak, on areas where reliance on the United States is traditionally very, very high. And so in the second half of this video, I want to look at 3 of them: nuclear weapons, air combat systems, and also non-weapon systems like satellite internet and communications. And if you're looking at areas where reliance might really matter in a strategic relationship, there's a reason I bring up nuclear weapons first. The basic argument here is that yes, conventional weapons are obviously very important, but nukes are different. I think one of the sadder lessons that some countries might take from the war in Ukraine and other conflicts in the 20th and 21st centuries is that as far as preserving the fundamental existence of your state from a foreign invasion goes, plutonium usually beats paper. If, like Ukraine, you don't either have your own nuclear weapons or are explicitly under the protection of a country that does, you're always clearly going to be at a massive security disadvantage compared to a country that does. We've got plenty of historical precedent now that proves that having nukes doesn't guarantee you victory in a war, far from it. But they do appear to work fairly well as a backstop against the worst possible outcomes. Because it's hard to imagine an opponent having any strategic objective worth having a bunch of their major cities experience an unplanned 3 a.m. sunrise. The extension of that, however, is that getting your nuclear shield from someone else requires a very high degree of trust. In order for extended nuclear deterrents like the US nuclear umbrella to work, opponents have to believe that the nuclear guarantor state, in this case the US, would genuinely use nuclear weapons to protect its allies, risking escalation and putting America's own cities at risk, even if there was no existing nuclear threat to the United States. You have to believe, for example, that if Russian troops were advancing in Poland and using tactical nuclear weapons in order to do so, that the Americans would be willing to use their nukes right back, even if the Russians explicitly said that they would not target the continental United States unless the Americans used their nukes. The problem there from a game theory perspective, if you take a purely transactional approach, is that it might be really tempting for a US government in the moment to decide that it isn't really worth risking Boston for Bialystok. And if Moscow believes the US might fold if pushed to that point, there might be an incentive to roll the dice on a very high-stakes bullying attempt. For nuclear shields to work then, you probably want more than just a transactional relationship. You need one where the nuclear provider is deeply invested in the security situation of that region and potentially willing to risk taking one for the team if necessary. That obviously has some significance in the context of the existing tensions between the United States and many of its allies, with the other bit of context being changing attitudes in Europe. In Germany, for example, for many, many years, a majority of the public actually opposed the presence of US nuclear weapons on German territory. But if you look at the survey data from 2023, opinions had changed. And Merz is now saying he wants to talk to Britain and France about potentially extending the protection of their nuclear arsenals across other countries in Europe. So if the goal is a European nuclear deterrent that can function independently of US nuclear coverage, there are really two roles that we're talking about. The first is the strategic deterrent, covering the Armageddon end of the spectrum, which is where the submarine force and the SLBMs come in, which is where the strength of the French and particularly the UK force currently lies. The bigger gap is probably in the area of non- or sub-strategic nuclear weapons, aka tactical nukes. Part of the reason they exist is to provide intermediate options on the escalation spectrum. So if the Russians were to fire a tactical nuclear weapon using Iskander against a military target, for example, the Allied forces have an option to firing a warning shot back or strike a military target, rather than resorting to launching a submarine-launched city buster against a tactical target, which might give the other side the wrong impression and potentially cause a miscalculation. Which is probably not ideal when you're talking about a scenario where a single oops can be of the civilization-ending kind. At the moment, this non-strategic and nuclear signaling role is largely filled by American B-61 gravity bombs through nuclear sharing agreements with a number of NATO countries, and therein might lie part of the immediate perceived problem. For the tactical and warning shot role, the most obvious immediate short-term solution would be to move some French nuclear assets forward to augment the American ones. Logistically, that probably wouldn't be overly difficult, rebasing some French nuclear-capable Rafales to German air bases, for example, along with a handful of ASMPA missiles, and with a maximum yield believed to be about 300 kilotons, or 15 times the destructive power of the device used against the Japanese city of Nagasaki, then a handful of missiles could represent a serious amount of get-off-my-lawn messaging potential. One of the most immediate problems, however, is a quantitative one. The United States is generally assessed to have around 100 B-61 gravity bombs in Europe under the nuclear sharing arrangements. The total French ASMPA inventory might only be half that. That makes a one-to-one replacement of the US bombs a literal impossibility in the short term. And couple that with the fact that the French will almost inevitably want to still base some warheads in France itself or for use by carrier aviation, and what you're talking about in the short term could really only ever be a partial fix. In the short term, there are also a couple of options on the strategic side, albeit with some limitations. Ideally, what the European states would probably want first is some sort of explicit declaration from the United States that the nuclear umbrella remains in place, since that both reduces the temptation for Russia and reduces the urgency of putting together a replacement tomorrow. That said, there might also be potential for change in French and British declaratory policy. Then if it's considered necessary to back up that policy with more scale, there's a couple of things the two navies could do. For example, one option to dial up the perceived deterrent effect quickly would be to increase the number of missiles and warheads each submarine sails with. On paper, for example, the UK's Vanguard-class submarines are each capable of carrying up to 12 missiles, each with 12 warheads. But in 2010, that was dialed down to 8 missiles per submarine with no more than 40 warheads total, and while the number was later raised again, we don't know for sure by how much. But if the UK wanted to signal a greater threat even against an opponent with a missile defence system, there is some capacity there to dial the missile and warhead count back up. Another option might be agreements on patrol scheduling. And indeed, in the short term, with more than 500 warheads between them, this challenge of potentially getting more missiles and warheads to sea is probably less significant than the UK's need for American support in keeping them there. Because while the UK designs and produces its own submarines and its own warheads, the Trident missiles that deliver those warheads are American. We'll cover this more when we look at the UK military specifically in the future, but the spark notes here are that the UK does not claim to have a fully independent nuclear deterrent, just an operationally independent one. Despite some of the claims I've seen online, the UK does not need American permission to fire its missiles or detonate its warheads, and as far as we know, technically on paper, the UK could choose to fire them at the United States if they chose to do so. If, I don't know, the America's Cup got particularly brutal one year or something. That's the operationally independent part. The not-so-independent part is that the missiles have to go to the United States for maintenance. Nuclear cooperation between the two is even at the point where the two next-generation ballistic missile submarines, the Dreadnought class for the UK and the Columbia for the US, will use the same missile compartment, the so-called CMC. Now, obviously, the US deciding to rip up the relevant agreements and cut the UK off from maintenance for its Trident missiles would be an incredibly extreme step. But in what might be a testament to just how nervous some experts, decision-makers, media organisations and members of the public have now become, in this, for lack of a better term, era of freely applied leverage, we've seen exactly that fear surface in a couple of places in the British media, noting that if maintenance support ever were cut, the deterrent would still be functional likely for years. But it would also presumably be on the clock, with fewer and fewer functioning missiles over time as they reached and then missed their maintenance windows. Given no one is likely to be particularly keen to fire a poorly maintained nuclear missile, that's not a great scenario. Now, if the UK government decided this wasn't an acceptable risk and wanted to reduce it, there would be a number of options hypothetically available, all different degrees of horrendously expensive and complicated, but doable. The three options would probably be A, find a way to localise maintenance of the Trident, 2, swap out Trident for a different missile that you do have access and maintenance support for, or 3, keep Trident, but add another system to the UK inventory as well to diminish the attractiveness of potentially using Trident for leverage. The quickest way to do that would probably be to follow the French model and go with an air-delivered munition of some kind, leveraging the fact that the UK already has the ability to build the two main components involved, a cruise missile and a nuclear warhead. Regarding the vulnerability and potential replacement of Trident itself, Dr. Marion Mesmer, a senior researcher at Chatham House, reportedly said, quote, "It would be a big risk if it wasn't being planned for, but it's something the UK government can't be too public about." She also said that, quote, "You could hope that France, the most obvious contender for Britain to work with, has a delivery vehicle similar to Trident that could easily be adapted, but it would require the French government and French nuclear enterprise being willing to share those designs with the United Kingdom," end quote. Now, based on the open source, I think we can go a bit further than that and conclude that there is currently one system in French service that does the same job Trident does. That's France's M51 submarine-launched ballistic missile that entered service around 2010, I want to say. The only problem, besides convincing France to hand over their nuclear secrets, and the deep emotional distress it might cause the Brits if they have to ask the French for help, isn't that it's not a good missile, it's that it's too fat. Trident has a diameter of about 2.1 metres and fits in a roughly 2.2 metre diameter tube, but France's M51 goes slightly shorter and slightly stockier at about 2.3 metres. That means even if you could put a British warhead on it, the only way you're going to fit an M51 into Britain's existing nuclear submarines is by changing up the tubes in the missile compartment. Or if you're not willing to do submarine surgery on your existing boats, you could potentially look at putting a new missile compartment in the dreadnoughts while they're still under construction. Ironically enough, it seems like the previous generation French missile, the M45, probably could have fit in a Trident tube if you appropriately sleeved it, but the last of those were retired in 2016. Now, switching out the missile tubes on a submarine is a pretty intensive exercise. Then again, during the Cold War, the Soviets did do it. But it would absolutely be a case of whether or not the massive expenditure to get a new missile and new tubes to launch it was worth it, just to minimise this potential geopolitical risk. And given that steel has already been cut on some of Britain's next-generation SSBNs, you'd hope that if a decision is ever going to be made, it would be made sooner rather than later. Once France and Britain have reached a level of industrial independence they're comfortable with when it comes to their nuclear arsenals, the question is whether or not the warhead counts they have are deemed sufficient. Here, the two powers look relatively minor compared to the likes of the United States and Russia, who each have more than 5,000 warheads, but with more than 500 collectively, it's not like France and Britain have nothing here. To put that into perspective, that's in roughly the same ballpark as most estimates for the current Chinese arsenal, although that's obviously growing much more quickly. Still, if there's a desire for some degree of warhead buildup, the capacity to do so, at least slowly, is probably there. According to the British Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, in 2016 the UK had a military plutonium stock of about 3.2 tonnes, noting that a couple of kilos can be enough to build a functional weapon. France, meanwhile, because, strategic paranoia, is believed to have about twice as much, approximately 6 tonnes of weapons-grade plutonium and about 25 tonnes of highly enriched uranium. So that really just leaves 3 questions. 1, how much, if any, do the two nations want to enlarge their nuclear arsenals as they take on a much more European-centric role? 2, if they do, who's going to pay for it? That is, will the cost be borne entirely by Britain and France, or will the countries who benefit from extended deterrence or forward nuclear basing potentially chip in? Another concern for countries benefiting from this nuclear deterrence might be making sure that they don't go through this whole experience again if there's a major political change in Paris or London. One potential option there would be to embrace an overlapping option with plenty of redundancy, where the countries that are protected by this nuclear shield are actually protected by 3, the French, the UK, and the United States. In that scenario, you're not screwed if a single isolationist is elected, only if 3 are elected at the same time. And a potential opponent who's considering testing your nuclear red line has to consider not just whether they can force one leader to back down, but whether all 3 will. Again, the point here is not to predict what will happen, but instead some of the options that might be available if allies decide to try and adopt a more European-centric nuclear deterrent. Another area of dependency worth looking at is probably air combat. To be fair, given just how reliant many NATO militaries are on the assumption that the United States would provide critical enablers in the event of a crisis, those would probably matter more in the event of a war than what exact jets the European states are flying. But given just how much discussion we've seen about the F-35 and its future in Europe, I think it's worth briefly looking at the importance of American systems to European air combat power and what it might take to move beyond it. You can essentially split this question into 2 categories: American subsystems and components that might have European equivalents but still have some advantages. American aviation engines and their tendency to end up on just about everything is a good example there. And then there is the centerpiece aircraft, the F-35, that doesn't really have a direct European competitor. Having skipped the 5th generation, though, there's a question about what happens next. At the moment, Europe has 2 6th-generation fighter programs that we know a decent amount about. The GCAP program, intended to produce, among other things, the Tempest manned fighter, primarily backed by the UK, Japan, and Italy, and the Franco-German-Spanish SCAF. Leading up to these events, however, it was never entirely certain when or if either of these very complex, very expensive aircraft would actually end up being fielded. If you think about some of the broad options that might have been available to European air forces here, none of them necessarily came without drawbacks. Trying to push ahead with a homegrown 6th-generation fighter would obviously provide a lot of capability, but also come with a lot of cost. At the same time, given the rate of technological advancement in countries like China and the United States, relying on domestic 4th-generation fighters forever might not have been viewed as a sustainable strategy. What some advocates were suggesting then was an even greater reliance on the F-35, perhaps combining it with some unmanned systems to boost its combat effectiveness, and then maybe, potentially down the line, adopting an American 6th-generation successor. From a cost-saving perspective, there are some forces that might have found that argument attractive, but if you assume countries have an incentive to minimise their dependence on the United States for their critical defence products, then suddenly the impetus for those joint 6th-generation fighter programs might become that much stronger. From a defence economics perspective, it wouldn't even be entirely about the aircraft itself, but rather everything that went into it. The Tempest program, for example, involves Rolls-Royce developing a new engine. It calls for improvements in material science, new sensors, new control systems, integration with new effectors, and the whole suite of other developments that go into building an aircraft. And so basically, if you manage to completely home build a 6th-generation fighter, you're going to end up with a lot of technologies and components that you can potentially now leverage in other designs and are less pressured to bring in from the States. A baseline objective for Europe then, if it wants to reduce its reliance on American fighters, American engines, etc., is at least one of these 2 programs making it to the finish line. It'll likely be expensive and difficult, but if countries like Britain want to maintain the ability to design and build fighter aircraft going forward, GCAP, the program which includes the Tempest fighter, or SCAF in the case of the French, the Germans, and the Spanish, may essentially just be the price of admission to the Future Air Forces Club. One potential twist to this story of allied nations trying to develop a future fighter aircraft independent of the United States, however, is that at least one US official, the Special Envoy to Italy, Paolo Zampoli, may have been pushing for a different approach. We can be confident that Zampoli did go to Italy and met with at least one Italian official, the Deputy Prime Minister, courtesy of a tweet by the Deputy Prime Minister. What we can be much, much less confident about is what was actually discussed. However, one source that I'll link in the description did claim that GCAP might have been at least a high-level topic of discussion, with Zampoli reportedly telling the interviewers that he discussed with Italian officials the possibility of the US getting involved in Tempest and the Global Combat Air Program. Zampoli reportedly suggested that a unified program would be a wise idea, offering all the parties involved an opportunity to save on costs, and is claimed to have said, quote, "If you want to get a plane done, it's better for us to work together. If you want a new plane, you need the United States." End quote. Given the United States already has 2 sixth-generation fighter programs, NGAD and FAXX, it's not immediately clear to me what the American goal would be in joining a 3rd joint European-Japanese program. I won't dwell on the story, given none of this has been confirmed, and we're not sure how serious, if at all, this kind of US proposal might be. And so for the moment, I'll leave it to the audience to determine just how likely the GCAP partner nations are to decide that what their program to develop air combat systems independent of the United States really needs is US participation and potentially US export-controlled components. In the past, potential US involvement might have been assessed in a different way, but there's always going to be a difference between a multilateral program bringing in other similar-sized or smaller contributors, like, say, for example, Sweden, Canada, or Australia, and dealing in the United States. What now seems more likely but still far from certain, however, is that you see these various countries making the necessary investments to make sure that they have the alternative systems and technology to operate alongside their American ones, to make sure they have the industry, the technology, and the options to reduce that degree of reliance from what it otherwise would be, and with it, the possibility that reliance could be converted into leverage. As to whether London, Tokyo, and Rome, or Berlin, Paris, and Madrid will ultimately decide that the money is worth having that independence, that industry, and that option, we'll see. One thing that will also be interesting to see as part of these European efforts is whether they extend the focus beyond just armaments. We're talking about things like critical technologies, communications, enablers, which, as we've seen in Ukraine, can be absolutely critical to the ability of a nation and a military to resist while under massive external pressure. The challenge for defence planners everywhere, though, is what happens when critical systems or technology that you rely on, whether that be GPS, particular spy satellites, or satellite internet, for example, get converted from essential tool to potential leverage in someone else's hands. And so to illustrate that, let's talk briefly about Starlink and go over to what is apparently the primary forum for international diplomacy in 2025, posts on X, formerly known as Twitter. Recently, Elon Musk, who obviously runs SpaceX, which controls Starlink, said the following, quote, "I literally challenged Putin to one-on-one physical combat over Ukraine, and my Starlink system is the backbone of the Ukrainian army. Their entire front line would collapse if I turned it off," end quote. Notice that Elon did not say that he was going to turn it off, only that if he did so, the consequences for the Ukrainians would be dire, which they would. Even though there's no threat there, you can imagine how someone might look at that potential statement and conclude it had a bit of a nice communication system there. It would be a shame if anything happened to it vibe, whether that was the intention or not. That drew the attention of this Polish bloke who said, quote, "Starlinks for Ukraine are paid for by the Polish Digitization Ministry at a cost of about $50 million per year. The ethics of threatening the victim of aggression apart, if SpaceX proves to be an unreliable provider, we'll be forced to look into other suppliers." That post drew the attention of the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who said, quote, "Just making things up. No one has made any threats about cutting Ukraine off from Starlink, and say thank you, because without Starlink, Ukraine would have lost this war long ago, and Russians would be on the border with Poland right now," end quote. If you're pedantic, you might suggest that Poland already borders Russia in the form of its Kaliningrad enclave, but I think it's fair to assume that Secretary Rubio probably meant Russia proper. For his part, Elon Musk followed up with, quote, "Be quiet, small man, you pay a tiny fraction of the cost, and there is no substitute for Starlink," end quote. The man they are responding to is Radoslaw Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland. He's a bloke with a long and storied history, who, for example, went to Afghanistan in the 1980s while the Soviets were invading it, where he acted as a journalist, something he apparently risked doing despite his own country being under Soviet domination at the time. And as for the country he represents, again, it's Poland. If the United States has an international fan club, for a long time, the Poles have arguably been the king of it. In 2023, polling data found that Poles who had a favourable opinion of the United States outnumbered those who didn't, more than 23 to 1, 93% to 4. That compared to, for example, a 59-38 split in the UK, 57-38 split in Canada, and even exceeded the 87-12 split that you could find in Israel. In statistical terms, there is a legitimate argument to say the Poles are more pro-American than Americans. They're also, from an American perspective, pretty much the model NATO ally. While some countries cut short their defence spending, Poland's gone north of 4%. While some European countries have tried to buy European, Poland's gone in for everything from the Abrams and HIMARS to Patriot systems and the F-35. They've also been consistent, strong advocates for US relations within the European Union, and when the United States lit the beacons in 2001, and then again in 2003, the Poles were there. Despite neighbouring a small piece of Russia in the form of Kaliningrad, tens of thousands of Polish troops would be deployed to support the US and NATO missions over the course of 2 decades. And obviously, Allied service being what it is, not all of them came home. The point is, the country being told to say thank you here is undoubtedly one of America's closest and most proven allies. The conversation, which you can imagine was probably being watched by every other minor and middle power in the US alliance network, saw the Polish foreign minister do perhaps one of the few things he could do. He said thank you, but in a way that publicly established a couple of key assurances. He posted thank you Marco for confirming that the brave soldiers of Ukraine can count on the vital internet services provided jointly by America and Poland. Together, Europe and the United States can help Ukraine to achieve a just peace. Elon, for his part, as you can see in the post there, indicated that Starlink would never turn off Ukraine's terminals, nor would they be used as bargaining chips. Some political figures in Poland subsequently attacked Sikorski. The former foreign minister, for example, suggested his Twitter access should be taken away, quote, preferably before it leads to the US withdrawing its troops from Poland, end quote. While the Prime Minister came out to say, quote, true leadership means respect for partners and allies, even for the smaller and weaker ones. Never arrogance. Dear friends, think about it. For the moment, I'll leave the potential political and diplomatic implications of exchanges like that to the audience. But it also arguably served to highlight another case of technological dependence. For the Ukrainian military, and increasingly for various allied states and businesses, Starlink is a fairly singular capability. As I covered in one of my videos on space, the United States, and particularly SpaceX, has come to absolutely dominate orbital launch volumes. And a lot of that is lifting Starlink satellites, to the point that in 2024, SpaceX, let alone the rest of the United States, accounted for almost 90% of all mass that humanity lifted into orbit. That gives it the kind of scale, accessibility, and bandwidth that other providers are going to struggle to match. There are other suppliers out there. Eutelsat's OneWeb system, for example, does provide satellite internet, but the differences in cost, bandwidth, coverage, and number of satellites in orbit are all massively slanted in Starlink's favour, which was repeatedly pushing more users, more organisations, and more nations to look seriously at Starlink as their preferred alternative. As we've discussed repeatedly, however, when you become overly dependent on one system, it can potentially be turned into leverage against you. In this case, leverage largely controlled, if you're talking about the civilian side of the system, by a single individual. And what that potentially does is provide an incentive for certain customers to seek out an alternative, even if it's more expensive, even if it's less effective or less efficient, just so that leverage isn't as dangerous. And on a totally unrelated note, the share prices for the French Eutelsat group, which had actually been struggling significantly in late 2023 and through 2024, are now up about 200% year to date at time of recording. If there's follow through on that growth and the rumours that tens of thousands of terminals will eventually be procured for Ukrainian use, I'd argue it represents another example of that economic theme we've been talking about. If there was plenty of trust in the system, the most economically efficient solution would be the shared solution. That, after all, was part of the secret of what made NATO so valuable, even to the United States. But in a world where leverage matters so much, countries and businesses might be willing to pay a premium to reduce the odds that they end up on the wrong side of it. Okay, so we know there's some momentum, and we've gone through a couple of case studies. But there is obviously a massive difference between governments intending to change something and that change actually happening. So at a very high level, let's flag a couple of the things that could potentially go wrong here. Problem one would be if the political statements are made, but the money doesn't follow. Maybe nations are given coverage to spend more through the escape clause, but don't end up following through. Or maybe funds are diverted to deal with other pressing issues, like the effects of an ongoing trade war. If that happens, then in some ways it might actually be worse than a scenario in which no one raised the prospect of rearmament in the first place. Because in order for this to work as effectively as possible, you need industry and investors to expect the governments will follow through. If they start moving and then nothing happens, there's room for some players to get burned. And frankly, the view might go, if a Russian invasion of a European country, coupled with a major diplomatic fissure with the continent's primary security guarantor, isn't enough to get countries moving seriously on the issue of defence spending, then maybe waiting for something to happen is a fool's errand, and capital and focus is better spent in other areas. Another risk is everything getting bogged down in internal turf wars, whether that's within a given country or between countries. If too much time is wasted fighting over questions of what exact equipment will be purchased, where will it be built and by whom, the chance of delays, cancellation, momentum being lost, or countries just essentially giving up and deciding to take the risk and import a system just to have something, probably go up dramatically. For example, there's reportedly been some debate on whether countries that are in NATO and in Europe, but not the European Union itself, should be allowed to participate in these European programs. Frankly, I think there's a strong argument to say that if you want to decrease reliance on the United States, you're going to need all the help you can get. So it would make a lot of sense for countries like the United Kingdom and Norway to be involved in the industrial effort. But again, the most important element is probably just that the question is resolved one way or the other and doesn't drag on over long, delaying the wider process. Then we can start talking about potential risks to the rearmament process itself, starting by making sure that enough rearmament funding is actually used for rearmament as opposed to other spending categories. There are a lot of things the European militaries might like to do if they get a sudden influx of funding. Hire more troops, increase pay and conditions, and make sure you schedule a couple of leadership conferences or development seminars in places like the south of France or Lake Como. But the element that's going to take the longest and requires the clearest demand signal is going to be the equipment. And so I think there's room for a couple of states to take a leaf out of Poland's book and make sure that when budget increases do occur, a significant chunk of that is dedicated straight to the stuff budget. You're probably starting to get the idea, so let's pick up the pace. There's a huge amount potentially be done with reforms to regulations, procurement processes, budget processes, and even things as simple as looking at the security clearance processes to make sure that when suddenly all these businesses need to start hiring more cleared workers to work on defence programs, that they're not left waiting so long that some of the blokes retire before they work a single day on the line. You could argue care also needs to be taken to make sure that more procurement money actually leads to more products, not just higher prices. Making sure that happens is easier said than done. It means maintaining competition, making sure that productive capacity is being lifted, not just orders, and making sure that happens probably comes down to how these systems end up being ordered. If you have all the European countries individually making small orders of slightly bespoke systems with relatively short delivery timelines, there's a risk you don't end up getting anywhere near the value for money you could. So where it's relevant, possible, and practical, you probably want to see joint procurements for large numbers of systems to the same broad spec spread over a long period of time. Instead of having 8 countries each try to buy 400 air defence missiles and get them as soon as possible, for example, have them order more than 3,000 collectively, spread that order out over more than a decade, and make sure that everyone is receiving a portion of that order every year so everyone gets at least something in the short term. Do that, and you might actually encourage companies to build up the supply chain, enabling you to lower prices and potentially order even more. Speaking of the corporate dimension, you can probably imagine, now that everyone believes that money is probably going to be on the table, a world where you see utter trench warfare break out between lobbyists, consultants, think tanks, state and local governments, and a dozen other actors besides, over the when, where, and what of future procurement. There also might be pressure on corporate leaders to focus more on maximising shareholder returns in the short term, rather than maximising the long-term sustained growth of the industry. That's the kind of environment where it might be worth some of these governments drawing on a little bit of World War II precedent, sitting down with some of these industrial leaders and basically trying to come up with a grand bargain. Basically an agreement to temporarily pull back a bit on some of the traditional lawfare and profit maximisation in the sector, for example, and instead just focus on ramping up production, getting momentum behind rearmament, on the understanding that that's the best possible path to generate sustained returns for industry and good rearmament outcomes for the nations involved. The 2 last potential pitfalls I want to talk about, even though there are obviously many more, is what's bought and how. We're talking about a lot of money sloshing through the system, but not an infinite amount. And these militaries simply are not going to be able to afford everything they want in the short term, and instead are going to have to focus on the things they need. I think the big point here is making sure that the less glamorous but essential products, like missiles, munitions, drones and counter-drone systems, spare parts, uniforms, communication equipment, logistics vehicles, all the basics you need to get a decent level of serviceability for a mobile force that is capable of fighting when it arrives, doesn't lose out to some of the blingier nice-to-haves. The first and cheaper priority should probably be making sure they're capable of fighting effectively with what they already have, before getting lost in the never-ending world of nice-to-haves. It's almost always going to be possible, for example, to spend more money on missile and air defence, but you probably wouldn't want that investment in defence to come at the cost of all the basics you need to underpin your offence and ability to deter. Finally, for this to work effectively, especially if one of the objectives is to reduce reliance on the United States, it can't really be a pure procurement problem. It has to be an industrial strategy problem. Basically a world where the question of what missile do I buy and how do I make sure that I'm manufacturing enough missiles are just as important as each other. Get that wrong, and you still might see these militaries build up significantly over the next decade or so, but the foundation of that buildup might not be anywhere near as solid as it could be. Even though those potential pitfalls might exist, however, and past European and particularly German procurements haven't always been perfect, there's a video for that if you're interested, it's not like the Europeans and the other NATO states don't have some potential cards to play. For one, the massive differences between different European states can actually sometimes be an advantage when you're trying to build up your defence sector. Some EU member states are just going to be lower cost environments with massive PPP advantages over other members. And so you might see giants like Rheinmetall or Hanwha setting up facilities in Romania or Poland, taking advantage of the fact that it's comparatively easy to integrate your supply and value chains between different countries within the EU. And so by effectively spreading out operations, there's room for companies to potentially harvest some of that PPP advantage. If treaties, agreements, or all-out EU membership allow it, you can imagine Ukraine also making a major contribution here. While quality control and keeping costs down are obviously always going to be a challenge in an environment where cruise missiles and drones are one of the most common causes of production disruption, the fact is Ukraine has already gotten very, very good at producing certain types of weapons in quantity for cheap. And if the goal is European armament, leveraging that Ukrainian DIB might be an attractive option. I'd also argue that while you're always going to run into issues like duplication, inefficiency, and the general difficulty of making dozens of different smaller militaries anywhere near as efficient, man for man or tank for tank, as a single unified force, there's potentially room for the non-US NATO countries to claw a little bit of efficiency back by focusing on national specialties. Even if all the major players are still all-arms forces, that doesn't mean they need to adopt equal weighting in their investment decisions. It might make sense for the Poles, for example, to focus on a large, heavily armed, ground combat-centric force. The fact they're right there on the eastern flank probably makes the logistics of moving all those tanks and artillery around that much easier, while it's just cheaper for the Poles to recruit and retain soldiers than it is for the likes of Norway or the Netherlands. For wealthier nations further away from Russia then, maybe the focus should be on more capital-intensive elements that don't require quite as many personnel. Aircraft and cruise missiles, space-based assets, critical enablers. Maybe you want the French and the British to focus on things like their nukes, their navies, and their expeditionary capabilities. Things that they can do and other countries can't, as opposed to trying to make the British Army 250,000 strong or something. The point is, you probably don't need a single unified European or allied military in order to realise some efficiency benefits here. All you need is for the Allies, as part of the defence planning process, to look at the collective requirements of the entire force and decide where it might make sense for who to specialise and how. If countries don't have the US or China scale resources to try and build a force that's good at everything, then maybe you focus on building a bunch of forces that are good at least something and then join them together. So in conclusion, where does all that probably leave us? I think the big picture view, very early in the process, is that European rearmament is possible. They do have the money, resources, and industry necessary to do it, but the nature of politics is such that everything remains highly uncertain. Whatever happens though, it's worth reflecting that something significant may already have changed. Because even if somehow the fissure between the United States and many of its allies is resolved tomorrow, the reality will still have been that it happened. And that might be enough for some countries to try and avoid what they see as future over-reliance on United States military equipment, out of fear that this kind of split could happen again, and their reliance could become a source of leverage. I think it's very unlikely that leads to an end of US defence exports, and a lot of their major companies have an order backlog stretching for years. But instead, what it might mean is a much more mixed procurement picture, where risk mitigation is a motivator, and potentially more of a shift away from the Atlanticist defence industrial model. The world absolutely hasn't changed in the sense that no one in NATO or the US alliance structure will ever buy American again. US deliveries and US sales will very much continue. Instead, I think it's more likely that places like Europe try to make sure they're never put in a situation where they have no other choice, and where European industry is capable of providing acceptable alternatives that underpin that greater defence self-reliance. In a sense, the US might actually succeed in its stated goal of getting the other NATO countries to spend more on their defence. Just perhaps not in the way they might have liked. Because in a world where even between allies, leverage is what matters, dependence and cooperation might be seen less as a pathway towards efficiency and economies of scale, but instead a vulnerability, with independence and industrial autonomy being the best way to hold more cards at the negotiating table. Whether the political will and money is ultimately there to put many of these countries in that position, only time will tell. But for the moment, the winds of change certainly seem to be blowing in that direction. And okay, brief channel update to close out. I have to say one of the great challenges of living in particularly interesting and rapidly changing times is it can sometimes be quite hard to keep up. But at the same time, I think there's often at least some link between rapid changes that we might see right now and patterns that have been going on for a longer period of time. European and allied rearmament is arguably a case in point. Spending started to ramp up years ago, albeit slowly, but I did want to highlight the aspect that arguably is new, or at least much more important than it used to be. The pursuit not just of improved defences, but of increased defence autonomy. In the coming weeks, we might start to explore that in a little more detail, looking at specific projects, specific challenges. But what I wanted to try and explain today was why changes in alliance dynamics towards an environment where leverage can be much more freely applied doesn't just have diplomatic implications, it can potentially challenge entire defence procurement models. Hence why I thought this issue was worth covering even before most of the allied nations have released their specific plans. I hope you got something out of the episode. Genuinely wish all of you the very best. And with my thanks as always, hope to see you all again next week.